Let's get started. Got a bunch to go through today and never enough time to do it all. So let's see how far we make it, but we're going to continue on Ezekiel, and we're going to kind of start off with looking at the end of chapter 20, goes into chapter 21. We get so caught up in the chapter numbers and verses, but you have to remember when they wrote this, none of that was there. Like, they didn't have any of that stuff. So if you look at certain ancient Bibles, we're talking like Septuagint, they will even have different chapters and verse numbers than the English Bible. So the one we have is not, the numbers and stuff next to it is not how it's always been. So it's for reference. It's just so you can get to places quickly. But some of these concepts and these ideas go together across multiple chapters. And so train yourself when you read your Bible to pay no attention to the chapters and the verses when you're reading. Think about, what did he start a new thing? Is this he moved on to a new area? So you can keep the context of it. It's like a really important factor. So Ezekiel 20 kind of leads into 21. So we're going to start there today. And we're going to look at kind of a prophecy a little bit against the south. And then there's some more riddles, I guess, surprise, surprise. Ezekiel's got more riddles to solve. So we're going to look through those. So let's start here in verse 46 of chapter 20. He says, Son of man, set your face toward the way of the south, and preach to the south, and prophesy against the forest of the territory of the Negev. And you must say to the forest of the Negev, Hear the word of Yahweh. Thus says the Lord Yahweh, Look, I'm kindling against you a fire, and it will devour in you every fresh tree and every dry tree. The blaze of the flame will not be quenched, and all the surfaces from the south to the north will be scorched by it. And all creatures will see that I, Yahweh, I kindled it. It will not be quenched. It sounds like something's going to get burned, right? Pretty self-explanatory. Do you remember the context of who he's talking to with this? Where were we at last week? Who was he talking to? He's sitting there, and who came to talk to him? The elders of Israel. And so he's still in that same group. They're sitting there before him, and he throws this language about this fire that's coming, to the south. And he has this language he throws out there before them. And he goes on to say, Then I said, Lord Yahweh, they are saying about me, is he not posing a parable? So he throws this thing about the fire out there to him. And what's their response? It's a parable. This actually, in the original text, literally means, is he not a spinner of riddles? So he's being labeled. You have to remember, he's got a lot of history of giving these parables. And so it's kind of a demeaning term to some degree. The elders see him, and they listen to him, and he never just speaks like, here's what's going to happen. It's always these parables and illustrations. And so they've kind of looked at him and been like, this guy's just a big spinner of riddles. He just makes these things to try to throw us, and it can be taken in a derogatory manner. Now, it's interesting because here we are in chapter 20, and if you remember back to chapter 2, God gave Ezekiel a specific warning about this kind of a thing. And you, son of man, you must not be afraid of them, and you must not be afraid of their words. He told them, when you say all these things and you do this stuff, what are they going to do? They're not going to believe it, but they're also going to they're going to label you. They're going to come after you. They're going to say, you know what, this guy's crazy. This guy's just a big, riddle maker. And it could be, discouraging. In fact, if you look at the verse, what is Ezekiel saying? Then I said, usually Ezekiel doesn't respond to God, but in this one he says, Lord, are they not saying this about me? You think he's a little bothered by the fact that he's coming across maybe like a storyteller, So he comes up with this thing called the sword riddle. Another riddle, right? So he kind of is a spinner of riddles, if you think about it. But they have purpose. What's interesting is God gives this fire illustration. Then he goes into a sword riddle, and then he comes back and says, I know you guys are too dense to get this. Let me just give it to you plain. Sometimes just give it to you plain at the beginning might make the most sense, but there's purpose in the riddle. Okay, so this is called the sword riddle. There's 4 parts to it. Shows up in Ezekiel 21. Here's how it starts. And the word of Yahweh came to me saying, Son of man, set your face toward Jerusalem, preach to the sanctuaries, and prophesy to the land of Israel. The oldest manuscripts and some text-critical stuff will say preach to the sanctuary. It's actually sanctuaries was changed based on a text-critical thing. So if it says the sanctuary, what does it mean? Who do you think he's talking to? The temple, yeah. preach to Jerusalem, preach to the temple, the leaders, the priests, all the people back there. And so the first part of this riddle is the part where the sword is drawn. So God's going to use this illustration of basically a soldier or an instrument of war. He's pulling a sword out, and he's preparing it, he's using it, and when he's done with it, he puts it back in the sheath. That's the whole illustration he's going to throw out them. But the first part is the sword is actually drawn. So it says here in verse 3, "Thus says Yahweh, look, I am against you, and I will draw out my sword from its sheath, and I will cut off from you the righteous and the wicked. Because I will cut off from you both righteous and wicked, therefore my sword will go out from its sheath to all creatures from south to north, and they will know, all creatures, that I, Yahweh, I will bring out my sword from its sheath. It will not return again." So this is the sword being drawn. So what's God, remember the elders are sitting there before Ezekiel, and he's giving him an illustration that what's coming to Israel. Judgment, right? Judgment's coming to Jerusalem. And there's this idea of who's the judgment coming through. So who comes and actually delivers this? Nebuchadnezzar, right? The Babylonians. Do you think the Israelites are sitting there going, well, it's the Babylonians' fault. They're the ones who did this. And God's going, no, they're actually not. They're an instrument. Who's the one who's doing this? He is. God is. Yeah, you've wronged him, not irritated another nation. They're an instrument. So when we say this sword imagery, they may have not understood that, but that's what's trying to be relayed, is that God's drawing up a sword. And who is his sword? Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is his weapon. Part 2. So God not only pulls the sword out, but he gets it ready to go. This is like, when you're getting ready to carve the Thanksgiving turkey, Verses 6 and 7, "You, son of man, groan with shaking hips, and you must groan with bitterness before their eyes." So this is another one of Ezekiel's wonderful performances. He goes out there, and he's doing this groaning by literally shaking before them. And then when they say to you, "On account of what are you groaning?" then you must say, "On account of the report, for it is coming, and every heart will be weak, all hands will hang limp, every spirit will be disheartened, and all knees will go like water. Look, it is coming, and it will happen, declares the Lord Yahweh." So they're going to look at him shaking and go, "Why are you shaking?" And he's going to say, "You have no idea what's about to come." Now, there's an interesting phrase he uses here. He says, "All knees will go like water." That's a nice way of saying you're going to wet your pants. Actually, in some ways, you could say all knees will run with water, is what it's implying. So this is kind of the crassness of Ezekiel a little bit. He's like, basically, when you hear what's coming, it's going to be so terrifying that you're going to wet your pants. The translators try to soften some of the stuff occasionally. They get the point across, but you think, well, like, my knees are going to go like water. Does that mean they're like weak? No, it literally means people are going to wet their pants because they are going to be so afraid of what is coming. Like it's not a good time that people are going to handle that. 8 and 10, he says, "And the word of Yahweh came to me, saying, Son of man, prophesy, and you must say, Thus says the Lord, say, a sword is sharpened and is also polished. It is sharpened to slaughter, a slaughter, polished to flash like lightning." So not only is Nebuchadnezzar being drawn up, God prepares his nation, grows him into this magnificent nation, but he also has a purpose for him, which is to judge his people. And it's not going to be quietly done. When he comes in and he destroys Jerusalem, does it not resound through all of the area? The people of God, nobody's been able to touch them. Think about their story. And then all of a sudden, here comes Nebuchadnezzar and boom, wipes them out. And the news spreads about this. What did they do? What did they do? Even Moses, when he tells them about what's going to happen if they reject, said that their neighbors, the nations around you, are going to say, "Oh my goodness, they must have turned to other gods because Yahweh's had it with them." So there's not only the judgment, the slaughter piece, but there's also the flash like lightning. It's going to be seen. It's going to be bright. It's going to be visible by all those who witness it, and they're going to know what happened. So it's this imagery again of the slaughter and the relaying of that information so people will see it. Second part of verse 10, "A rod, my son, is despising every tree, and he gives it to be polished, to be seized by the hand. It is sharpened a sword, and it is polished to give it to the hand of the killer." It's kind of a weird phrase, but when you kind of break it down, what he's saying is that what does a son do in this day? Probably not today. What does a parent do to their son who disobeyed back in this day? They'd go get a rod and they would spank them or they would discipline them. And God's saying, you're not getting the rod anymore. I've tried to discipline you and you haven't received it. So what's coming after the rod? The sword. So this is not an agent of discipline. This is an agent of judgment. That's what this rod in every tree, getting a branch, and that's what the purpose of that statement is that that time of discipline is over. I've tried. Didn't work. Verses 14 and 16, he says, and you, son of man, prophesy, clap your hands. Clap your hands literally is him saying, I want you to get a sword, and I want you to grasp it with both hands. He's not out there clapping. He's saying, get it, put it between your hands. Clap your hands around the sword. The sword will strike twice. So then he has him swing it, strike it a third time. So he's got this swinging he's out there doing. People are looking at Ezekiel like this guy's lost it again. Gather together, strike to the right, cause it to go to the left where your edge is directed. So he's out there swinging this sword around. Is this way of relaying, God's judgment. Who's swinging the sword? God is. Remember, Ezekiel represents God as the prophet. The sword is Nebuchadnezzar. Ezekiel represents God. You follow me? So what's happening? Nebuchadnezzar's coming, but it's by the hand of God. He's the one who's coming to bring the sword. Okay? This is where he gets into the agent. Who's the agent of the sword? He says, and you, son of man, mark out for yourself 2 roads for the coming of the sword of the king of Babylon. They must both go out from the same land, and hew out a signpost, hew it at the head of the road of the city. You must mark a road for the coming of the sword to Rabbah of the Ammonites and to Judah in Jerusalem the fortified. For the king of Babylon stands at the fork of the road at the head of the 2 roads to practice divination. What in the world is he talking about? So he tells Ezekiel, I want you to basically make a map. And I want you to take, and there's a road of where they would come, the Babylonians would travel down to come into this area. And there's going to be a point where it's going to fork off. And he says, I want you to basically put kind of like signposts and make your own little map, is what he's asking him to do. He says, because when Nebuchadnezzar follows this road and he gets to what most scholars think is Damascus, he has to make a decision. He has to decide how he's going to proceed. Does he go to the Ammonites or is he going to head to Jerusalem? And what's interesting is he's sitting there knowing that he needs to take this area over. And if you're an Israelite and you're going, well, if he comes there, let's just hope he goes to the Ammonites and leaves us alone, right? And it even makes the comment here as he goes to this and he stands there at the fork, what's he going to do? How does he determine which way to go? Because he needs to take the whole area, but how is he going to decide on if he should go left or he should go right? Ammonites, Jerusalem, what's he going to do? Practice divination. Now, this is like a big no-no, right? You don't practice divination. But it's really interesting because remember, who's the agent of God's judgment on Jerusalem? Who's he bringing? Nebuchadnezzar. And he's pagan. And when he goes out and decides, I need a decision to be made and I need to consult the gods, he doesn't go to Yahweh. Who does he go to? His gods. But in this case, he does go to his other gods, but what does Yahweh do? Intervenes. I'm going to give him information to get him to do what I want him to do so that he'll end up in Jerusalem, not the Ammonites. Why? Because he's the agent of my wrath against the Israelites. So it's really interesting concept to think that the evil people, the pagans, can go out there and use pagan things and God can still say, I'll get what I want accomplished through that. You're not supposed to do it. But this guy's a pagan. He's not an Israelite. And I need him to do this. I raised him up to do this. And so I will use his own methods to get him to where I need him to be. So the evil think, well, no, they don't have anything to do with God. No, God has absolute control over them just as much as he does the righteous. The next verse is really an interesting one. Remember, he's going to practice divination. And it says he shakes the arrows, he inquires with the teraphim, and he examines the liver. Somebody explain this one to me. This is a weird one, huh? Now remember, this is Nebuchadnezzar, pagan, Babylonian. He comes to the crossroads. He's got a decision to make, and he doesn't know which one to go with. So what does he do? Everything was supernatural. You have to remember, they had their own deities. Everything was linked. The decisions were made with a god or gods in mind so that they could feel like they were being directed properly. It wasn't this secular, civilization that we think was, without God. They were, but they had their own. And so they would go out there and they would reach out to them. And these are three ancient processes that were done in Babylon specifically, but in other cultures to try to figure out what the gods wanted. So this is not like a strange way of saying, he's just trying to make a decision. No, these are actual practices. So in Babylonian divination, the first one they talk about is the shaking of the... I'm going to get there. Okay. Teraphim, yep. It's one of their actual processes. So I'll show you. Okay. We'll take them in order. Shaking of the arrows. What does this sound like? Shaking arrows. What are they doing? Have you ever played dice games? You shake the dice, then what do? You throw them. And then the randomness of how they land determines on how you play the game. You roll if you go to a craps table, what do they do? Was it 7? I don't even know. You roll that, you win. But whatever it is, it's random. Random. Is it really random? This is the question. Casting lots was a common thing. In fact, when Judas is gone and they're trying to figure out between two guys to replace Judas, what do? They cast lots. Because what's the idea? That we don't know, and we couldn't possibly make a decision here to favor one over the other. So we need divine involvement. So they put chance or randomness, they wouldn't think of it that way, we do. And they throw it out there and they say the deity will direct how they land. And that's how we'll know what we should do. So it was totally based on, we're just going to put it in the hands of God, and we're going to use this method to do. Remember the Umin and the Thummim? These are the things, the rocks that the priest had in his chest. One probably had, either was black and the other one was white, or they had different markings. And there was times where they're like, we don't know. This lady came in, she claims her husband was cheating on her. We don't know. We can't figure it out, so we better ask God. So they would get these rocks, and they would, boom, and they would say, oh, looks like it's bad news. Because they didn't know. They had to somehow say, well, it's beyond our knowledge, but we need divine information. So they would use these casting lots methods to try to figure out what God wanted. It's kind of weird, but it's not uncommon in the ancient world. It was happening all over the place. So the shaking of the arrows is actually called belomancy, and it's where they would actually go out, mark the arrows differently. They would put them in a bag, shake it up, and then they draw an arrow out. And if it had the marking on it, yes. If it didn't have the marking on it, no, or whatever their options were. And that's how they did it. It's like casting lots. That's what they basically did. The drawing was done to see what the gods determined. The gods will decide what we direct. It's not randomness. The gods will decide. That was their mindset. There's also, we already did that one. Inquires of the teraphim. So he shakes the arrows. He inquires of the teraphim. So the question really is what do you mean by teraphim, right? What's a teraphim? So these were small idols, probably not real big, maybe like this, something even maybe you could carry around. And they represented a lot of times their ancient ancestors. So those who had passed away, they would have a little picture or a little idol carved of them, and they would have it in their houses, or they'd take them with them or whatever. Most likely they were used as mediums. So in other words, that person's already in the afterlife, so we're going to inquire for them, and then they're going to reach the deity, and then the deity's going to tell them, and then they're going to tell us. It's like fortune telling kind of. Most of the time we see them, they represent the dead. So they're basically inquiring of the dead for information. Is that a no-no in God's world? Yeah. In fact, when Saul does it, he goes to the witch and he says, what should I do? Who shows up? Samuel. And Samuel says, you're going to die. It's not a good thing to go and inquire of the dead. So anybody that says, Christian mysticism, Christian fortune telling, no. Bad stuff. Not good. That's a pagan thing, and they would go and they would try to do that to figure out what they want to do. What do our ancestors want us to do? Maybe they can talk to the deity for us. It's associated with, in the ancient world, this group called the Rephaim. You can kind of see the connection. Teraphim, Rephaim. See it? The Rephaim were understood to be spirits of the dead. So the Rephaim are a group that kind of understood as those who had passed on. And they would consult them. You're not supposed to, but in the pagan world would contact them to try and figure out what they should do. Interestingly, is teraphim, that's not the only time that it's there. Have you ever read about the teraphim anywhere else in Scripture? It's actually several places. Here's one of them. Remember the story with Laban, and he has the sheep, and they manipulate the water so he can get the ones he wants? Well, at one point, Rachel is going to leave, and it says, now Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel stole the idols, the word is teraphim, that belonged to her father. So what did she take? She took the little things, probably ancestral models that he had in his house to represent those who had passed away, and she stole them, and she's basically sitting on them. That's the story. In fact, you can see right here, idols, look underneath there where it's the Hebrew, teraphim. There it is, T-R-A-P-I-M, teraphim. Okay, so it's the same thing. It's written idols in Genesis. In Ezekiel, it says teraphim, but it's the same word. Same word, okay? 1 Samuel 19, then Saul sent messengers to David's house to guard him and to kill him in the morning. But Michal, his wife, told David, saying, if you do not save your life tonight, then tomorrow you will be killed. So Michal lowered David through the window, and he sent and fled and escaped. And Michal took the household teraphim, there it is, and put it on the bed and put a quilt of goat's hair on its head and covered it with the clothes. So she's basically creating he's sleeping in there, but it's a household idol. And this one must have been pretty good sized. A household statue or a teraphim. Now the first question you usually ask is, what is David doing with teraphim in his house? Right? Now just because they were used for these bad things doesn't mean that they weren't there for good purposes too. And I'll explain that in 1 second. Okay? Here's in 2 Kings. In the 18th year of King Josiah, the Passover was kept for Yahweh in Jerusalem. Moreover, the mediums and the spiritists and the household gods, teraphim, there it is, and the idols and all of the abominations that were seen in the land of Judah and in Jerusalem, Josiah removed in order to establish the words of the law written on the scroll that Hilkiah the priest had found in the temple of Yahweh. So under King Josiah, what does he do? We're getting rid of all these things. Getting rid of them all. Interestingly, here's Zechariah 10:2. Because the teraphim speak deceit, and those who practice divination see a lie, and the dreamers of vanity speak in vain. Therefore the people wander like sheep. They are afflicted because they have no shepherd. So what were they doing? They were consulting these teraphim. Genesis 31:30. Now you have surely gone because you desperately longed for the house of your father. But why did you steal my teraphim? There it is again. Why'd you take them? You notice here that it's used interchangeably. This is the story of Laban again. Remember, she's sitting on those little idols. Well, when Laban calls her out on it, he doesn't say teraphim in this one. What does he say? Elohim, which we usually take as a name for God. But Elohim was an understanding of any spiritual being. Why did you take my Elohim? I consult these things. These are my, my little passed over dead relatives or whatever, and they looked at him as real, elements of engagement with the spiritual world. Elohim shows up in many places. It means gods. It means it's really a bad. When we read God, we think of Yahweh, right? But in the ancient world, there was a lot of gods, and so when the ancients write in the Psalms, they use the term Elohim as God, Yahweh, but he is an Elohim, and there's other Elohim. They're spiritual beings. Yahweh's just the best one. He's the top dog. He's the most powerful. He's the greatest. But there are other beings out there that are not. And here's where Laban talks about it a little bit. Hosea 3:4. The children of Israel will remain for many days without a king and prince, without sacrifice, stone, and stone pillar, ephod, and teraphim. This one just flat writes teraphim. Talking about the end of Israel. Hosea is talking, remember, this is right at the end of, go find a wife who's a prostitute, marry her, and have kids. And then right after that, this is what it says. And it's about this relationship God has with Israel, where they have committed adultery against him. They're not consulting him, And now they have nothing. Do we have teraphim today? We do have them in our houses. Every one of us does. You know what they are? They're pictures of people who have passed away. That's the modern version of it. Now the difference is we don't consult them, hopefully you're not, calling up, great grandma or cousin Bob or whoever and being like, what should I do? Can you help me make a decision? This explains why David could have a teraphim in his house and it not necessarily be like God's done with him. He's an idol worshiper. It's because they would take, and they didn't have the Polaroid, which now I think is gone anyway, or the iPhone, and just snap a picture and print it out, put it in a thing, and set it on your mantle. What did they do? They had to carve it. I want to remember my great-grandma. They would have it carved by a woodworker, or they would do it themselves, and they'd put it there, and they would say, I want to remember, every time I look at that, great-grandma or great-grandpa or whoever. And so that was their teraphim. The problem is they got out of control because what did they start to do? Worship them, consult them. So during the reign of Josiah, probably the last great king of Israel, what does he do? He says it's gotten so out of control that they're all going to be gone. Like the culture has gone so bad, everybody's getting rid of teraphim. We're just going to make them universally gone. Think of the snake on the pole. Do you remember the snake on the pole? God tells Moses to make this. He makes it so people can look on it and be saved. It was an act of faith. But what happens later on? What do they start doing with it? They start worshiping it. So they had to ultimately destroy it because people were worshiping it. So something can be really good, and it can have good purposes, and then what can happen? People take it and they wreck it. Does that not happen with everything in our culture today? Facebook, iPhones, you name it. Things that can be really good can be used in really bad means because people use them for the wrong purposes. And here, you have these teraphim. They show up in all kinds of Old Testament texts. But when it comes to Nebuchadnezzar, he's a pagan. He doesn't understand their place like the Hebrews should. So what does he do? He consults them. We're going to talk about it. We're going to reach out to them. We're going to see what they'll tell us to do. Third one, examines the liver. We don't do this today, thankfully. It's actually called hepatoscopy. Okay, it's what the ancient phrase of it is. They did it not just in Babylon, but all over the place. And you were looking at the entrails of an animal that was sacrificed for a sign. Trying to figure out what is the deity telling me by looking at this. Okay? Specifically, they were looking at the liver, and there was like markings on it. And if they saw certain markings, they would say, oh, this is a message from the gods. And that sounds crazy, doesn't it? This is from ancient Babylon, 2000 BC. This is a clay sculpture of a liver. Okay? That's what this is. It's a sheep's liver. And if you look really closely, see how it's broken down to all these squares? Every one of those has got a writing on it that tells you if there's a marking there, this is what it means. This is 2000 BC. This is even before the exile. We're in about 590 BC. 1,500 years earlier, they're looking at sheep's liver saying, what does the deity want me to do? So this is a clay model. It's broken into quadrants and sections, so you would say it's up here in this corner, that means something, and then in this particular section, this means something, and then they would act. So here's what it says. In his right hand is the divination for Jerusalem. So he's got his arrows, he's got his household idols, he's got the liver, and he's got you can imagine him, they think he stopped in Damascus, because that's where this would have split. And they think he basically said, okay, I don't know exactly how I'm going to do this yet, so let's get these guys in, let's get the diviners in, and let's figure out what we're going to do, and we'll consult the gods before we move on. And that's what he did. And so what does he have? To put to battering rams, to open a mouth for slaughter, to raise the battle cry, to put up battering rams against gates, to build a siege ramp, to build siege works. He probably stopped there, consulted all of his gods, and then said, okay, we got the plan. We're going this way, and here's how we're doing it. And why is God telling Ezekiel this and telling him to tell the elders? Because they think it's just this pagan guy who's coming with these things, and God's going, no, I actually am the one who told him what to do. I'm using his pagan approach to get him here and to show him how to defeat you. Because the whole point is, who's the sword here? Who's the sword against Jerusalem? Nebuchadnezzar. But who is wielding the sword? Yahweh. and he will swing it however he wants. And he doesn't want Israel or the people in Israel to think that anything else is happening besides that. He doesn't want them thinking it's their gods or it's just the greatness of Nebuchadnezzar and his nation. It is Yahweh is bringing him through whatever means they want to go with right to our step and going to have us defeated. Like, you are not getting out of this, is the bottom line. Goes on to say, and it will be to them like practicing divination falsely in their eyes. So what are they going to do? They're going to look out and be like, oh man, he doesn't have a clue. He's practicing, all these pagan things. It's false. He's not really getting told to come to Jerusalem. They have sworn oaths for themselves. There's no way. I promise he's not coming because he's consulting evil spirits, not good ones. So there's no way he's making it here. They're going to take that upon themselves to kind of give themselves some comfort. And what's God doing through Ezekiel to them here? Don't think that. When that pops out and you're told that, I'm telling you, I'm the one behind it, and they will come. You are not going to miss this. But he will bring their guilt to remembrance so as to seize them. So the agent of the sword, Nebuchadnezzar, is coming. And they can tell themselves whatever they want. They're not going to get away from it. It's not going to pass. So there's an indication they stopped in Damascus. He had to decide which direction to go, so he consulted the gods, determined the best route and methods, and then he went. Verse 28 says, thus says the Lord Yahweh to the Ammonites. So the people that are also in the land that are pagan, and their disgrace, and you must say a sword is drawn for slaughtering, it is polished for holding, for flashing like lightning, when seeing a false vision for you in vain, when practicing divination for you falsely, to give you on the neck of the profane ones of the wicked, whose day has come, the time of final punishment. In other words, the Ammonites, you're not getting out of this either. Don't think just because they went to Jerusalem, you're not getting it. The whole area is about to get it through Nebuchadnezzar. And this is directed specifically at the Ammonites. They're disgraced because they've been doing pagan things too. Verse 47. Now we go back, and God says, I gave you the sword illustration. Let's talk about that fire again. Remember at the very beginning, I'm sending a fire. Look, prophesy to the south. It's going to consume the land. It's going to consume all the trees. Well, that's imagery for when Nebuchadnezzar comes, it's going to be a complete takeover, complete devastation of Judah and Israel, north and south. So he says at the end of this wonderful, another riddle, right? The sword riddle. He says, look, I'm kindling against you a fire, and it will devour in you every fresh tree and every dry tree. The blaze of the flame will not be quenched, and all the surfaces from the south to the north will be scorched by it. Now they have to stop and say, oh, okay. There's something coming. And there was the sword illustration, and there's the fire illustration, but the idea is complete devastation and slaughter at the hand of Yahweh. That's the key. And he wants them to understand they're not getting out of this. And it will be complete. It will be full across the land. Thus says the Lord Yahweh to the Ammonites. We read that a sword is falling. So this is the damage to the Ammonites. Again, that's the final swing, is he's going to take out Israel. He's going to take out the Ammonites. And then in verse 30, he says, return it to its sheath in the place where you were created. In the land of your origin, I will judge you. So what's he saying here? He's talking about the sword again. And so the sword's done. It's taken out Israel. It's done all the damage. Then what's he do with the sword? Take the image. Pulls it out, sharpened it up, used it, and then what does he do? Puts it back. And it's interesting is, where does Nebuchadnezzar go after he destroys Jerusalem? Where does he go? Back to Babylon. But it's not just over for Nebuchadnezzar. Notice the very end of it, he says, in the land of your origin, I will judge you. So God's taken there's nobody, it's just me against the world, kind of at this point. Nebuchadnezzar's my instrument. And when he's done executing judgment, I'm going to take him back to his land, and then what am I going to do to him? I'm going to judge him. And if you recall, then there's the Daniel verses that talk about, how Nebuchadnezzar was prideful, and God, what does he do to him? He basically turns him into an animal for 7 years and kicks him out. And he says, again, this is about Nebuchadnezzar. I will pour out my anger on you. I will blow on you with the fire of my wrath, and I will give you into the hand of brutal men, skilled craftsmen of destruction. You will be as fuel for the fire. Your blood will be in the midst of the earth. You will not be remembered, for I, Yahweh, I have spoken. Again, what is he saying here? You're going down too. You're not going to be the one that everybody flocks to as the example. Who comes in? Nebuchadnezzar, his son, ultimately turns it over to the Medo-Persians, and they come in and assassinate him, his son, and then they take over the empire. Darius the Mede comes in and takes over. That's the statue. Remember Daniel sees that statue? Nebuchadnezzar's just the top of it. He's just the golden head. But then after him comes the Medo-Persians, and they take him out. Then they get destroyed by the Greeks, and then the Greeks get taken out by the Romans. And you got the whole statue. These are all happening at the same time Ezekiel's talking to these guys. Nebuchadnezzar will face his judgment as well, because he was not subject to Yahweh. Now, I'm going to consolidate a bunch of verses here, because we could go through all these and we'll be here for months. But there's reasons, again, that God lists in chapter 22 of judgment. Why am I doing this? And I'm just going to give you a quick list of what they were. Because he says, I want to talk to you leaders, the princes, the kings of Israel really quick. And I want to talk about each one of you, okay? So he says, look, the prince of Israel, each one according to his strength. And then he lists all these things that they did. All the stuff. Here they go. Idols. We know that one, right? We got that one. Becoming unclean with them, with all kinds of things. Treating parents with contempt. These are listed in chapter 22. These are the things God says, these are the things you guys did that you shouldn't have done. Murdered the innocent. Shed innocent blood. You extorted foreigners. These people came to live in your land and you took advantage of them. You neglected and abused widows and orphans, children. Now, once you get done with this list, I want you to think about our culture a little bit. Stolen other men's wives. Now, there's a whole list of these things. We're going to come back to this one in a minute. Various perversions and sexual immorality took place. He lists a bunch of them. Bribes to shed blood. In other words, violations of the law. You had a law to keep, and it was supposed to be impartial, and you took bribes so that you could convict innocent people for your own political gains. You look at this list, and you think about what's going on today, and you go, oh my goodness. All listed violations can be connected with these things. Violations of the relationships, your parents, your relationship with Yahweh, relationships were destroyed and violated. Violations of the well-being of the most vulnerable in society. The widows, the orphans, the kids, the foreigners were all neglected and taken advantage of for the purposes of the leaders and the people who ran the country. Sound familiar? 3, they violated the Sabbath and the religious observances. They didn't keep the Sabbath, and they just didn't do the stuff that God told them to do as a nation that was loyal to Him, founded on Him. So He became a back seat or completely removed. Violations of precious human life. So this would be the shedding of innocent blood, murder. You could probably throw in their neglect for the kids. Again, it just adds icing on top of the cake, right? Do we have these things happening today? Violations of pagan inclusion in society. Paganism starts to seep in when it was supposed to be kept out, the practices. We'll actually talk about that one here this morning in our sermon. Violations of sexual perversions. Just again, sounds like our culture. Every one of them can be put into these things. Violations of justice and law. We don't have that happening, do we? Violation of trust of those who look to power. They're supposed to be the leaders. Remember, it's the princes of Israel he's saying this to. You guys are supposed to take care of the people underneath you, and you violated their trust. So every one of them fits into these particular violation categories. Worst of all, and here's how God ends it in Ezekiel 22:12. And so you have forgotten me, declares the Lord Yahweh. He lists all this stuff, and then what does he do? The reason all these things have happened, and the worst thing of all, is you have forgotten me. And when you forget God, everything evil rushes in. Happens in personal lives, happens as a culture, happens at a church, happens everywhere. If you forget Yahweh, you forget God, the void will be filled by something else. And usually it's man turns to that God, and then they become whatever they want, do whatever they want to do, even if it's wrong.